2 Protagonist, students of Satoru Gojo, and the potential to surpass the strongest. Besides, constantly talking about Gojo vs Sukuna, this matchup between Yuta, Kotsu, and Yuji Itadori has quickly become the most popular matchup within the JJK fandom, but it's not as clear-cut as many would have you believe. That doesn't necessarily mean that this matchup ends in a one-way beatdown on either side, or that this fight is incredibly close. Just that there's more to this fight that you should be considering when finding out the winner of today's video. I'm Jaded, and I really don't feel like wasting your time, so before even reminding you to subscribe and like the video because 99% of you guys don't, let's get started. Durability and attack power is the first thing to consider, and both Yuta and Yuji have their own lethal techniques that make this hypothetical scenario somewhat complicated. Yuta, without his ring and connection to Rika, which I'll be calling his base form, is already boxing with Ryu Ishigori, but there's some pretty insane misconceptions with comparing Ryu and Yuta in his base state. He's hit point blank with Granite Blast, but extremely far away. Later, Yuta's hand is constantly eating the raw power of this technique until the point it's completely charred. You can clearly see his hand not being as damaged while already coming in contact with Granite Blast, with the damage starting to slowly pile on at his knuckles. Ryu constantly firing off this attack means that his reinforcement can be chipped down and overwhelmed by relentless power over time. Considering he's already getting hurt by Ryu's normal punches, which should obviously be below his Granite Blast, this argument speaks to his insane endurance and not just durability, which could be very helpful when going up against Yuji Itadori. Yuta can't just take a Granite Blast or Ryu's normal punches. His base form in general doesn't do much in terms of attack potency against Ryu Ishigori. If we're strictly talking about durability feats, he doesn't really have any showings of perfectly tanking attacks. But to be fair, that's not really too important if Yuta's endurance is insanely high. Endurance is simply the amount of damage that you can take or endure before getting sent back to the lobby. Fortnite characters, for example, can be damaged by enemy weaponry but have enough endurance to survive multiple strikes despite taking some damage. One really good example within the series is Dagon. He can still be damaged by Nanami and Naobito, but was said to have boundless HP. Just try to imagine that Dagon's literal health bar is just really that big. Just like your Fortnite character not being durable enough to take absolutely zero damage, there's still that health bar that represents the amount of damage that you can endure or suffer before you're actually taken down. That's pretty much exactly what's happening during Ryu and Yuta's first encounter. Yuta isn't durable enough to take Ryu's punches unharmed if he doesn't block perfectly, but he does have enough cursed energy to, according to Ryu, bolster his endurance and take more damage but still keep fighting. Yuta's massive cursed energy reserves reinforce his body all around at maximum output throughout the entire battle. We're shown this during his encounter with Yuji all the way back when he saw Choso and Naoya, and it's been true ever since. That reinforcement doesn't mean that he's immune or durable enough to take zero damage from Ryu's punches, but that he can minimize the damage and endure more strikes. When connecting his ring, this is really when it starts to get problematic for Yuji. Firstly, there's access to Rika, and the form itself that I'll be calling Rika mode. Rika herself is crucial because she's insanely powerful. She's even compared to Yuta himself in multiple instances and can keep up with his attacks and might even be more durable according to Ryu. But this duo wouldn't be as complete if they didn't complement each other so perfectly, and that's exactly what makes Yuta's curse technique copy extremely optimal. Strictly focusing on the AP department, Yuta gains access to Thin Icebreaker, and cutting out all the fluff and being straightforward, this attack can damage Ryu, who's also more durable than Yuta, but also Yuji. Sukuna said this himself, and I highly doubt that there's any real reason to say that he's lying or that he's being miscalculated, considering that he's fought all 3 sorcerers with the same curse technique. His Pure Love Beam is the strongest technique in his arsenal. It's an accurate high output blast that can only be released when Rika is fully manifested. Its overall attack power is weaker than Ishigori's Granite Blast, but both are clearly comparable. Not only is it visually shown with Yuta's Pure Love partially canceling out Granite Blast and cushioning the blast before hitting him, but you could also argue that the narrative and the story itself is trying to explain this to you directly. Ryu is hungry for someone to rival his power and considers Yuta and this beam struggle specifically as one of the greatest meals. It's consistent and definitely true that Granite Blast is overall stronger than Yuta's Pure Love, but it's clearly not by a lot if Ryu is able to enjoy himself just this much. So Yuta's Pure Love Beam, while obviously scaling below, should be somewhat comparable to Ryu's Granite Blast, which is obviously stronger than his regular punches, which can already hurt Yuta but also take down a fully manifested Rika. One thing that's fair to note is that this Ryu is clearly ramped up. It should be incredibly obvious in my opinion, just judging by how this strike in particular is depicted, but Rika is hit with other punches and she doesn't end up unmanifesting like she does does in this particular scene. Ryu actually being stronger here does make sense narratively, and probably a bit more than you would think. He's giving into his true desire for combat, and he's fulfilling that hunger that he's kept within him for over 400 years. Without getting too deep into the narrative breakdown, you see this example with Gojo becoming the honored one, Hanami starting to enjoy fighting and literally growing stronger during the Goodwill event, and Sukuna's dialogue in multiple scenes brings us to this one consistent idea that throughout the story, when people give into and begin fulfilling their true desire, they're gonna grow stronger. This punch is clearly depicted differently on purpose. Ryu is fired up, and outside factors like his own enjoyment contributed to this punch being even stronger than probably the granite blast that he shot at Rika earlier, since she didn't unmanifest. It's probably not something you can really compare back directly. The statement does bluntly mention that if Rika had been fully manifested, then she still would have been knocked out the fight, but to be fair, she isn't even awakened here. In Volume 0, Yuta makes a binding vow with Rika, and Geto mentioned that he surpassed the limit of cursed energy, which probably refers to cursed energy output. Rika then awakens and her eye opens, so you can infer that this possibly means that she's becoming stronger through the binding vow. This definitely does make sense when you take into account that Rika is clearly having some intense emotions that are being fueled and ignited in both scenes. We've seen Yuta in Volume 0 being fueled by intense emotions, and it's something that Geto says directly that made Yuta stronger, so clearly this concept already existed within the power system in Volume 0. Yuji isn't just going to be worried about taking down Yuta, because Rika being there changes this fight completely. With Rika present, we might even see some combination or strategy based attacks that might be problematic for Yuji with the vast amount of techniques in his arsenal. There's so many more techniques that Yuta has access to besides Thin Icebreaker, but there's really no need to go explaining all of them, and I'll cover some of them later in the video. Thin Icebreaker can damage Yuji along with Pure Love, so he has both physical close range attacks and mid-range blasts, which are all options for a Kotsu to do some lethal damage. But now what about Yuji Itadori? Just like Yuta, he's not a pushover, and all this glaze better not have made you forget who's the real protagonist of the story. His raw attack power with just cursed energy reinforcement is absolutely insane. He fought Sukuna before Shinjuku, but this was after incarnating within Megami, and his output is restricted by his vessel's own soul. Yuji does have some extremely impressive performances specifically during this encounter with Sukuna, but they're only really that impressive depending on how you interpret Sukuna being nerfed. There's two possible ways to interpret his limited cursed energy output. One refers to that both his body and curse technique usage along with physical movement is being affected when fighting Maki and Yuji. That second interpretation would be that during this interaction, there's nothing that really suggests that his physical movement is even relevant because there's no mention that anything has really changed. If you think that Sukuna's physical abilities like reinforcement and therefore durability are being nerfed, then Yuji's punches and feats damaging this version of Sukuna really don't matter since they really can't be measured. There's other retranslations like from Lightning Claire, who's an active translator for the same company that publishes the official JJK release, whose Twitter that you can find on screen, and within those translations there's literally no mention of Sukuna implying that his physical ability is nerfed, and says outright that it doesn't go as far as hindering his movements within the vessel. Yuji striking a 15-finger Sukuna, who's probably not taking him super seriously, doesn't change the fact that he was still damaged when knocked in the face. It's a pretty good feat for Yuji's striking power. There's also Black Flash, which only raises that crazy attack power, and it's debated exactly how accurate the exponential boost with Black Flash actually stands, but it more than likely doesn't really make any sense. But regardless, it's not like Black Flash doesn't massively upscale Yuji's already insane raw power. While you can't really quantify it, let's just say it's pretty freaking strong. Damaging Sukuna at 15 fingers worth of his original power is already making his normal punches scale way higher than anything that Yuta's ever displayed with his normal striking power. But even if you're skeptical about that AP scaling, it really doesn't matter because Yuji's punches can also strike the soul. Some would argue that there's nothing that really directly states this outright, and most Yuji haters just argue that he's only striking the barrier between the souls, so this strategy isn't effective overall on non-incarnated sorcerers like Yuta Kotsu. You could argue that Sukuna implied that these soul strikes undo the bath ritual and therefore lowered his control and overall cursed energy output. Obviously, Yuta isn't incarnated or a vessel like Sukuna or the other Culling game players, so there isn't really two souls to separate by striking the barrier like Megami's body. This part really does come down to your own interpretation. Since Yuji can already target the barriers between souls, has naturally learned how to damage Mahito's soul, has way more knowledge than before thanks to Yuki Tsukumo, and Sukuna himself mentioned Yuji seizing his own soul directly, but I'd probably say that the part with lowering his opponent's cursed burst energy output and control of their body is exclusive to incarnated sorcerers because Sukuna directly mentions the back. If you do think that Yuji can damage the soul, then using Dismantle will only add to this already crazy but lethal attack power. Regardless, at the very least, his attack power is enough to damage Yuta even without the soul-based attacks, especially when awakened. Yuji's insane endurance and durability almost really need no introduction. Pain alone can't stop Itadori from continuing forward. Unless he's taken down, then there's virtually nothing that can stop this monster. He's blocked attacks and tanked blows from Sukuna and even his Black Flash. I'm sure you're already aware of his insane endurance and durability, but I'll touch on that later. What's really crazy and honestly underrated are these gauntlets. These gloves are extremely durable and stronger than Yuji himself. There's multiple instances where Yuji is damaged, but these gauntlets never shatter until these slashes surgically cut them off from his arms. It's not really an anti-feat for the gauntlets because you could just argue that it was from chip damage that occurred over the prolonged fight with Sukuna, so it really doesn't matter. These slashes are from a version of Sukuna who had only taken a very few amount of soul punches, and they didn't even scratch the gauntlets, but they managed to cut through Yuji's own body. There's very similar feats that happen shortly after this too, like Higuruma being taken down and more dismantles being blocked by Yuji, who takes 0 damage in the parts of his body that were blocked by his arms. You can clearly see that his reverse curse technique is only restoring the parts of his body that his hands couldn't cover because of the range and area of effect of Sukuna's dismantles. They even take cuts from a level in Shrine without shattering, while Itadori's leg is completely torn off. When we start talking about speed, this is really where this topic begins to get pretty complicated. There's one fight in particular that people bring up when scaling this matchup, and there's already some pretty big misconceptions. There isn't one single moment within Yuta's domain expansion where you can say that both of them are comparable outside of maybe travel speed. This instance, for example, with both Yuta and Yuji running across this pillar is at best travel speed and not combat speed. If you take, for example, an Olympic sprinter and have him run the dash in record time, that doesn't prove that he can kick at speeds that would be comparable to an MMA fighter. Combat speed and travel speed are separated on purpose because you have to account for things like building up momentum and top speed, which don't really matter when you're talking about throwing a punch. This feat is borderline useless for scaling anything else other than travel speed, but even then, there's one thing that you have to account for that doesn't have anything to do with what I just said. Here's an example of why none of these feats really work for scaling both of them to each other. In this scene, Yuji does reach Sukuna and lands a strike before Yuta when starting off behind him, but this could also very easily be Yuji making an opening since Yuta is trying to use Charles's curse technique. If Yuta is playing around Yuji's opening since they're not only teammates but it's his own domain and he has all the curse techniques, then it makes perfect sense why Yuji would be the one to go ahead to actually make those openings. That's also very possibly what's happening when they're both running along this pillar, which also does make sense considering that Yuta is still holding the same sword that he uses later for Charles's future sight. They're meant to be working together and they're not racing against each other, so I really don't understand why these feats are compared as much as they are. Here's another example of Yuji holding back one of Sukuna's arms and leaving Yuta to close in and attempt to get an easier slice, and that doesn't have anything to do with them being around the same level. Why would Yuta even try outspeeding Yuji if Yuji can just go in and make the openings that would only benefit him? You could say at best that Yuji is comparable to Rika if we're being generous during this fight, but then again she's not even fully manifested. Taking into account Yuji's awakening is another topic entirely. Yuta just blatantly can't be scaled back to that version of Yuji whatsoever since Sukuna's power is constantly changing. To say the least, it's really hard to measure accurately. Some people could argue that they would need to be around the same level to work with one another in the first place, and while that's true to some extent, that doesn't mean it's impossible to have a disparity between both fighters even if they're working together. They can still work together even if they're not completely matching each other in power. Unless they're matching each other's movements, which is just blatantly not happening within this domain, then they don't really need to scale to one another to work together. Ino and Yuji, and even Yuji and Maki before, are perfect examples. This really only has to be true with Gojo level fighters working together with other special grades. I could very obviously see why somebody like Gojo and Yuta just blatantly can't work together, but Yuji and Yuta just would never have that big of a gap no matter how you look at the scaling. Meaning at best, the argument that they can't work together unless they're close in power really doesn't make sense, assuming the disparity isn't some Gojo to Yuta level difference. Then at that point, it really just comes down to how you interpret the narrative. Both Yuta and Yuji are considered to be part of the heavy-hitting fighters against Sukuna. Yuji is placed alongside them in the end of the story, and the protagonist beating the main villain definitely fits the typical shonen stereotype, with the protagonist standing at the end of it all as one of the strongest. But assuming that Yuji is one of the strongest because of the typical shonen stereotype would be utterly ridiculous. But regardless, he's definitely considered one of the heavy-hitting fighters, and he's shown directly alongside them on the color page for chapter 240. Now this part comes down to how you define the group itself. If they're only called the heavy hitters and grouped together because they're just the strongest around, then that doesn't necessarily mean that they have to be around the same level. If you wanted to take, for example, the best 3 NBA players to ever live, they would still all be top 3 as long as they're above everybody else, even if they're not comparable to each other whatsoever. But the heavy hitters being around the same level is actually just consistent on its own, and it's part of the dream that Gojo had at the very beginning of the story. He doesn't want one singular person to burden the weight of being the strongest. He wants to build up his own group of strong but intelligent allies. Yuta and Akari are constantly being brought up in the same context, and at least at this point in the story, undoubtedly, they're trying to be portrayed at around the same level. You can make similar arguments for Maki Zenin, and that's already 3/4 of the entire group. Yuji is also brought up in the same context as Yuta and Akari, and Gojo especially talks about how he isn't an exception when talking about his dream. Gojo's exact words are literally written on the colored panel that portrays Yuji right next to all the heavy hitters. His dream being realized is directly symbolized by not one person being the single strongest, but instead a group that he always wanted for the future. Narratively, it doesn't even really make sense for one of them to outclass all the others because Gojo would never want that, and that's clearly not the big conclusion to Gojo's dream. While it's true that there isn't really any direct scaling between Yuji and Yuta that's pretty consistent, the narrative seems to support the idea that they're definitely around the same level, and the lack of scaling really doesn't change that. With all that in mind, let's finally get started into the matchup itself, and I'll be dividing this video into 2 rounds, starting with Rika mode Yuta versus Awakened Yuji. Rika being present during this fight is going to be Yuji's biggest problem. The fight already being this close between both of them means that she might be able to create openings or maybe even assists like we've already seen in Sendai Colony. Yuta activating Curse Speech might work, but probably not considering that Yuji would be expecting that. Most of those hidden techniques that have caught others off guard like Sukuna are going to lose that element of surprise because Yuji already knows about them. There'll be no confusion like with Oro and Ishigori, and Yuji will probably already have his ears protected with cursed energy. Yuta's Thin Icebreaker is probably his best option since using Rika's Pure Love Beam is probably too difficult to pull off against somebody as fast as Itadori. The only 2 times that this was ever seen in combat was when he fought Geto and he used it reactionary to Geto launching off his Uzumaki, and against Ryu, who flat out let him charge up the beam because he wanted them to clash. Yuji, who obviously doesn't have his own beam to clash with Yuta, definitely won't take his chances letting Yuta charge up this blast. Nothing really besides wearing Yuji down or using a Thin Icebreaker is going to be able to put him down. Yuji's gauntlets can also block Sukuna's slashes even from Malevolent Shrine without breaking, and they're way more durable than Yuji himself. Even if they were hit with something as strong as one of Yuji's black flashes, they still wouldn't break. One of the very basic principles in physics from Isaac Newton himself is that for every action, there is also an equal but opposite reaction. If these gauntlets weren't strong enough to contain the force of a black flash, then they would shatter on impact, which they clearly don't. Any attack that doesn't break through Yuji or scales below any other attack that clearly doesn't break through these gauntlets will be blocked. He's shielded himself from attacks before, and there's nothing stopping him from doing the same against Yuta's sword strikes if he's capable of keeping up with both him and Rika. Even if Rika does turn this close fight in Yuta's favor, the problem is taking him down in 5 minutes. Once the timer is up, Yuta goes back to fighting Yuji alone. That would mean Yuta would be in his base form, and this fight is already over considering that Yuta only has his sword and basic cursed energy infused attacks until that also reaches 0. But Rika and Yuta should have the edge unless Yuji lands another black flash. The problem really comes down to his insane endurance and stamina. With Yuji consuming the Curse Womb Death Paintings numbers 4 through 9 before Shinjuku, he can now convert his cursed energy directly into blood and doesn't need to waste positive energy on restoring all that blood that's circulating throughout his body. That's usually the main factor in why the reverse curse technique is just so demanding. We see that from Yuta himself in Sendai Colony. Even if some of his limbs are completely disconnected, Yuji can just reattach them extremely easily. If you do think that Yuji could damage the soul, then Yuta can't really recover as easily since that requires being aware of the outline of your own soul. He's held on to Rika's soul and seems to be capable of seeing her soul, so you could make some arguments, but nothing is really super conclusive. There's also the argument about how Rika's soul is now freed from the cursed spirit, so maybe Yuji's punches won't actually work on Rika. These two and their soul-related topics could be an entire video, but you're free to believe what you would like. Yuta's speed using the reverse curse technique also seems to be comparable with Yuji within his domain expansion when they had both taken the same attack from Sukuna head-on. Nothing really directly suggests that your reverse curse technique speed gets faster within your domain expansion, but that would just mean that at worst, they're still pretty comparable when Yuta's potentially buffed and at best Yuji is faster. If Yuji doesn't get overpowered and can keep using those gauntlets to protect himself and outlast Rika, his chances obviously go up dramatically, but this depends on several factors that we don't really know. Yuji's dismantles, if targeting the soul, will be extremely worrying for both of them, but there's also Yuta's Thin Icebreaker, which, considering how much damage had been done to Ryu, probably means that it will be even worse if not blocked by Itadori. Yuta is still capable of bolstering up his endurance like Ryu said, but there's only so long that Rika will be around to keep refilling up his cursed energy pool. Outlasting Rika by constantly restoring his body with the reverse curse technique could work, but again, this mostly depends on who's hit with the first heavy blow. If Yuji does land a Black Flash, which doesn't even really seem all that unlikely considering how many times he's pulled them off when he's needed to, or he ends up outlasting Rika, then there's nothing really that could be done for Yuta. What makes Black Flashing really dangerous for Yuta, outside of the insane amount of damage that he probably can't endure for much longer, is that you could argue that Yuji grows stronger between each of his Black Flashes according to Sukuna. It's not as apparent within the official release, but when retranslated by TCB, Sukuna questions if Yuji chaining together his Black Flashes is an attempt to climb up to his level. Some might say that it's not necessarily Yuji growing in power, but rather Sukuna is getting actively weaker with every attack at his vessel. However, Sukuna saying climbing up makes me believe that at the very least, it's possibly a combination of both. Narratively, they're already portrayed to be pretty similar, so Yuji growing stronger means it's really bad for Yuta and Rika if they can't overpower him in the 5 minutes. Either way, this completely depends on how fast Yuta can actually take down Yuji within the 5 minutes, because if the 5 minutes are up and Yuji is still fighting, then Yuta has a serious problem. The fight probably ends with a domain expansion anyway, so let's get started on round 2. Eventually, Yuta's fight with Yuji leads to both of them casting domain expansions, and both will feel the spark of cursed energy and raise their hands to complete the end of this fight. Even if you think that one is much faster than the other, they should still be able to cast domains. This micro movement takes virtually no charge up time, and this is where the fight ends regardless of most scenarios. Just being straightforward, we don't know exactly what determines what happens during a domain clash, and we're only given vague metrics that don't really have any direct form of measurement. Sukuna's domain seemed far more refined than Gojo's with his barrier being open, but it still ended up clashing evenly. You could see the same thing happening with Megami and Dagon. Gojo is stated to have better efficiency than Sukuna, but Sukuna has more cursed energy volume than Gojo, and we have no idea what Gojo even means when he says compatibility, but the bottom line is that both of them still clashed evenly anyways. You can only really make arguments for other people maybe suppressing other domains during a clash like we see with Jogo and Gojo when there's such a large disparity of power between them, but really besides that, it just comes down to experience. Yuji trained with Kusakabe to learn simple domain and managed to pull off a perfect domain expansion on his first try. That was also something he blatantly said was thrown together on the fly. However, Yuta within Gojo's body, when actually casting Infinite Void himself, he manages to pull off a tiny styled barrier that only Gojo had ever performed. You'd probably say that Yuta has better experience at using domain expansions on much higher levels than Yuji, and that's completely true. However, one thing that most people don't really take into account is that it's really hard to compare these examples. Within Gojo's body, Yuta has the 6 eyes, and these eyes are directly stated to affect using curse techniques which are imbued within domain expansions. Besides the super precise control over your own cursed energy that even lets you manipulate space on the atomic level, there's also that muscle memory from Gojo's previous times using his own jutsu from his fight with Sukuna, or really any time that could have ever helped him perform these feats like Tiny Barrier. The muscle memory overlaid on Yuji's body is what helped him develop so rapidly according to Kusakabe, and it's the entire strategy for the body swapping technique before Shinjuku. Using Kenjaku's curse technique and taking over Gojo's body with all that experience and muscle memory could have aided him through instinct and not really directly skill when performing these insane feats to some degree that we can't really measure. You could act skeptical and say regardless that Yuta could still do a tiny styled barrier since Gojo only needed the experience that he gained from the prison realm, but that's also a statement taken very out of context. Experience is the only stated determining factor, but the context is talking about Gojo, where skill in general is always irrelevant and other things that I've mentioned earlier might have solved for that part of the problem. Gojo is good at pretty much everything that he knows how to do, and if there's something that Gojo can't do, it's probably because he doesn't know how to go about it. You see this time and time again with him pulling off a red when finally figuring out how reverse curse technique works. You also see it through the numerous domain clashes with Sukuna before finding out the tiny barrier is a thing, and this is also pretty much flat out stated and explained when he pulls off a simple domain within Malevolent Shrine. Skill not being mentioned here as a factor also doesn't mean that it's just about experience, and that would be an argument from ignorance. If you're generous and don't think that the 6 eyes or muscle memory placed any role in casting this domain expansion, then Yuta could do the same to Yuji if they clashed in his normal body. But overall, this is probably too generous since there's just too many outside factors to consider, but it's completely up to you. Yuji's domain expansion also seems to be extremely massive, and here's a calculation on screen. Yuta's domain domain doesn't seem to be nearly as big for sure. Yuji's domain does have its own functioning sure hit attack through dismantle, except within his domain, Yuji doesn't need to make physical contact to begin separating Sukuna's soul, and we've seen dismantle work on physical objects before, so maybe it's possible he can attack Yuta's barrier from the outside. But this argument is very much just, I'm not even gonna lie, like plugging in your controller into Yuji, because it's literally something he has never done before or even remotely mentioned. You could say that sure, in theory, Yuji should be able to pull it off, but it's already a little bit more hypothetical than anything else in this video. Some people bring up Yuta being able to change his barrier's coordinates as a reason to believe that he's better than Yuji and would win during the clash, but this to me is pretty nonsensical and proves next to nothing because it's irrelevant. Changing your barrier's coordinates could display a very highly skilled feat using barrier technique, but I've already explained why barrier technique and all those examples where people clash with definitively worse barriers don't actually determine the end result of the clash. In terms of experience, Yuta has definitely casted way more domain expansions than Yuji and is blatantly more experienced, but Yuji having Sukuna's muscle memory and his body remembering what it's like when Malevolent Shrine was casted, which is probably what's helping Yuji pull off this very first domain expansion, makes this very all uncomparable. If I had to pick one person, I would probably say Yuta Akotsu because he has the actual experience and we know that muscle memory is something that has to awaken over time. But if Yuta doesn't just overpower and suppress Yuji's domain nearly immediately and they evenly clash, not much really changes besides obviously both of them getting stronger since the outcome is pretty much the same. Except now obviously Yuta has access to all of his curse techniques far more easily than before and he just needs to grab onto one of the infinite swords placed within his domain expansion. This again depends on who takes the first heavy strike, but most of the time I would say that if Yuta's domain breaks from the damage done to his body, then Yuji definitely wins and it's the same the other way around. This fight is only never really close if Yuji manages to land a Black Flash, since at that point it's already game over for Yuta and Rika, but being within Yuta's domain expansion gives Yuta and Rika far more options for landing those heavy blows to quickly take him down before anything serious can actually happen. It is probably harder to prove that outside the domain expansion, Yuta could win even if Rika does give him the advantage because of Yuji's endurance, stamina, and reverse curse technique, which seems to be far more efficient for fighting for longer periods of time than Yuta and Rika, who literally have their own time limit. However, within the domain expansion, there's just too many options for quickly using multiple curse techniques like Thin Icebreaker or Future Sight that will definitely leave Yuji overpowered. It's definitely possible to see this fight playing out multiple ways, but more than likely, this is how it ends once reaching the point where they both need to use expansion.